So before we even really start down this road, let's define cultures, right? It's right there in the course title, Alaska Native Cultures. What do we mean by that term? Because that can mean a lot of things, right? People can use culture to refer to things like high culture, right? Sort of drinking wine and going to the opera or something like that. People can use cultures almost synonymously with countries sometimes, right? So cool, American culture, English culture, Ethiopian culture. Or people can sometimes mean sort of like on a very specific level, like the culture in my workplace is toxic or the culture in my workplace is really good. Let's talk about what we mean by cultures here as people taking an anthropology class. What it includes, it means, and also what it means to understand a culture, because that's important, right? I've got here two examples of representation, where Alaska Native people are being represented to wider audiences, one of which I consider an example of accurate representation, one of which I consider to be an example of quite inaccurate representation. The first is a movie that you'll watch later in the semester, a film called We Up that was put on by Anchorage Museum and talks about a variety of different examples of hip-hop culture among Alaska Native communities. And so first of all, I like that movie because it shows us that people can have multiple cultures that they're taking part in, right? People can be taking part in the culture of their village and of their ancestors. They can also be taking part in the culture of, let's say, the religious group that they may attend. They can be taking part in a musical culture such as hip-hop. Below, this is from a play called King Island Christmas, which we'll also talk about later in the semester, which one of the authors will make the argument, and I think a good argument, that it misrepresented King Island Native folks in some pretty inaccurate ways, very inaccurate ways, which was unfortunate, very unfortunate. So what I'm trying to get at with this, though, is that we are exposed to representations of cultures all the time, right? We're constantly kind of learning messages from media about these things we call cultures. But what is a culture? For us as anthropologists, when we use that term, and the way I'm kind of using that term, I mean that they are the shared and learned things that you pick up on by being part of a group. It's the stuff that you do as a group that's not just basic human default, right? It's basic human default that babies cry when they're hungry. It's basic human default that we walk on two legs if we're physically able to once we reach a certain age. However, a whole lot of the rest of our group behaviors are things that we pick up by being part of a group. So culture is that stuff. It's our shared and learned, right? We share, it's something we have in common and that we learn, that we pass on to other generations who of course might change and negotiate and rearrange the culture, but still it's something that's sort of being passed down to some degree through generations. And it affects how we think, how we communicate, and how we behave. Of course, we're not trying to suggest that cultures determine all of that for people. Nobody, well, or perhaps very few people, are just some like A to B like copy and paste of their culture, right? We all have our uniqueness and our individuality, and that is as true of small cultures as it is of cultures with very large populations. Nonetheless, cultures have a huge effect on us, right? The fact that when you get out on the road, you just know that you're supposed to drive on the right side of the road, and the fact that when you're trying to make a decision among your friends about where to go to eat, you're probably going to do it in sort of a vote, which is not unlike how we choose our political leaders, is also a good example of the fact that often cultures just sort of are taken for granted ideas about how we do things. And it ranges from the microscopic, like I was just saying, which side of the road you drive on, to the cosmic, right? So we'll talk many times in this course about specific indigenous ideas about how do you ensure well-being within the community in relation to the environment and ensure that food continues to come and ensure that life is meaningful for people. It's both symbolical, not a word, symbolic, and practical. It includes things like how to fish. It also includes things like how do we paint a fish in our specific culture. It is powerful, like I said, but also fluid. It's something that gets changed every generation. And that's a really important key theme in this class, because we'll talk about the fact, and I talked about it last time, and I'll talk about it again this time, and I'll talk about it again, I promise you. Just because a culture has experienced changes doesn't mean that culture is no longer that culture. My ancestors, as I think I mentioned last time, were hanging out in covered wagons, right? And log cabins. And of course, I don't hang out in log cabins or covered wagons. And so we may do things different than our ancestors from 200 years ago, but the ways of thinking and communicating oftentimes are very powerful and continue down the line. We sometimes think of culture as a way of life, right? And it's something that every human group has to have. We are able to adapt to almost every single environment on the planet, in large part not because we're biological wonders, although we do have a few cool things about us, such as our long-distance running abilities, but more so because of our cultures, because of our ability to find successful ways of living in a space. Or to put that differently, without cultures, we'd all be dead, or rather, we wouldn't be alive as a species. So, that's the idea of culture. Culture is something then that you have by virtue of being part of a social group. So cultures are something we have by virtue of being in a social group. And we often use those terms interchangeably, although technically they're different, right? To say that when we say something like Tlingit culture, we don't mean there's technically Tlingit society or social group and Tlingit culture, right? Culture being the way of life of that society. So the people versus the things that the people are sharing is their culture. Something to keep in mind. There are three really important caveats, actually, that brings up. Things you gotta remember about culture as we talk about cultural backgrounds in this course, and as we try to better understand the cultural diversity of the people around us. Number one, people can come from multiple cultures. In fact, most people do. Again, they may have their specific cultural identity as a Denaina person, let's say, or as a Gwich'in person, or as an Inupiat person. They may also have an identity as an Alaskan person, right? There are aspects of ways of doing things that we kind of have as a state, as an American person, things that we kind of share in common as part of being part of the United States. And on and on and on. Perhaps also they happen to be, let's say, Protestant Christian. So then that would be another layer of identity, right? So to the extent that people can have multiple groups they're part of, they can also have multiple cultures, and most people do. And groups, of course, can, as a result, have multiple cultures. And cultures aren't isolated or static. They can change over time and be influenced by the groups around them. But that's the basic idea behind cultures, and if you understand that, it's really going to help a lot of other things make sense in this course. So I wanted to make sure we kind of were defining the terms similarly.